There is a law older than the 5 territories, older than the great pacts, older than even the stone walls of Vordheim Castle. It is not written in any council charter. It is not carved above any healer's door. But every wolf who has ever drawn breath in the Lycan world knows it as clearly as they know their own heartbeat. The strong protect the strong, the weak serve, and the cursed disappear. The winter of 1497 should have been remembered as the year of the frozen harvest moon, a rare and sacred event that came only once in a generation. Instead, it was remembered as the year the most powerful Alpha King in 3 centuries collapsed on the floor of his own throne room, black veins crawling up his neck like cracks in dying ice, and not a single healer in all of the known territories was willing to press their hands to his chest to save him. They said he was marked by the goddess herself for punishment. They said the dark rot consuming him from the inside was contagious, a judgment on his bloodline for sins his ancestors had committed. They said a great many things. None of them were true. His name was Cesario Vane, king of the 5 territories, commander of the Wolvenmark, the last scion of the Iron Throne. He was 32 years old, and he was dying on cold stone while the people who had sworn their lives to him looked the other way. And the only one who came, the only one who knelt beside him without fear, without hesitation, without a single thought for her own safety, was a girl that every pack on the continent had spent 17 years pretending did not exist. Her name was Saoirse. She had no last name. She had no rank. She had no pack. She had only a curse that had followed her since birth like a second shadow, a pair of hands that glowed silver in the dark when she slept, and a heart that had never learned how to abandon a dying thing. This is the true story of what happened in the winter of 1497. The council annals recorded it as a miracle with no explanation. The truth was far more devastating and far more beautiful than any miracle. A roar can shake mountains, but silence is the sound a kingdom makes when it is afraid. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks before the king collapsed. It started as a tremor in his right hand during the morning war council. Alpha Cesario had been mid-sentence, pressing 2 fingers to the territorial map spread across the oak table in the great hall of Vordheim, marking the disputed borderland of the Ashfin Plains, where the Duskwater pack had begun raiding outlying settlements, when his hand shook so violently that he knocked over a goblet of water. The liquid spread across the map, darkening the paper, bleeding the ink of border lines into one another. For a long, terrible second, nobody spoke. Cesario stared at his own hand the way a wolf stares at a wound it does not recognize. Then he clenched his fist, pulled it back from the table, and continued speaking without acknowledging what had happened. The eastern garrison will move at first light. Lord Brennan, I want your riders on the Ashfin Road before the moon changes. Lord Brennan Ashville, his oldest general and the alpha of the Stonecroft pack, nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on the king's closed fist, and behind those eyes, Cesario could see the thought forming, the same thought he had been burying under layers of duty and iron will for the past 3 weeks. Something is wrong with him. Cesario was not a man who allowed weakness. He had inherited a fractured kingdom at 19 years old when his father, King Vane, had been killed in the Battle of the Red Crossing. He had spent the next 13 years hammering 5 warring territories into a single kingdom through a combination of military brilliance, political ruthlessness, and the kind of sheer force of will that made lesser wolves instinctively lower their eyes. He had scars on his back from arrows. He had a broken rib that had never healed quite straight. He had buried his father, 2 generals, and a younger brother. And he had never, not once, shown the council anything but absolute control. So when the trembling in his hand returned that evening during dinner, and when he saw his steward, Wulfric, carefully not looking at it, Cesario quietly excused himself and went to the physician's tower alone. The tower was a tall, narrow spire at the northern end of Vordheim Castle, filled with the smell of burning herbs and bottled compounds. The healer's name was Marin, a sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 50 with gray-streaked hair and the kind of calm that had taken decades to build. She had served the royal household since Cesario's father's time. She was not easily rattled. She was rattled. Cesario did not miss it. He saw it in the way her breath hitched when he extended his arm, in the way she held his wrist with two careful fingers as though the touch itself required courage. She pressed a glass lens to his inner forearm, studying the faint, barely visible thread of darkness running beneath the skin just below the crook of his elbow. It was the color of a bruise at its deepest point, not black yet, but the color that black becomes when it is still deciding. "Marin, my king, what is it?" It was not a question. Cesario asked things the way other people stated facts. Marin set down the lens and folded her hands in her lap. Outside the window, the wind threw snow against the glass in sharp, brittle bursts. Somewhere below in the lower courtyard, a wolf was howling, one of the night patrol, calling the all-clear. The ordinary sounds of a castle that had no idea what was sitting in its physician's tower. "It has a name," Marin said carefully. "Among the elder healers it is called the wasting vein. It is a corruption of the body's natural channels, the pathways through which a wolf's power flows. When those channels are compromised, the corruption spreads inward. It consumes." "How long have you known?" Another pause, longer this time. "I suspected when you came to me a month ago about the fatigue. I confirmed it 3 days ago." Cesario was quiet. The fire crackled. He looked at his hands, both of them, open on his knees, the way a man looks at tools he has always trusted and is now learning to doubt. "Can it be healed?" Marin did not answer immediately. That was its own kind of answer. "There are healers in the southern territories with knowledge older than mine," she said finally. "There are texts in the Vordheim archives that reference cures, counterrites, blood bindings, root compounds from the deep forest that no healer has brewed in a century. But the wasting vein, my king, it is not a natural illness. It does not come from cold air or bad water. It is planted." The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "Planted," Cesario repeated. "Someone has done this to you, deliberately, precisely, with knowledge of the dark arts that has not been practiced openly since the purge of 1401. Cesario stood. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller without him doing anything intentional. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark courtyard below, the torches guttering in the wind, the shadows moving between the walls. "Who else knows?" he asked. "No one, I swear it on the moon." "Good." He turned back to face her. "Keep it that way. I need time to find the source before whoever is doing this realizes I know." "My king," Marin's voice wavered just slightly. "The wasting vein is progressive. The longer it is left untreated, the deeper it roots. If it reaches the heart, the core of your wolf, there is no cure that any healer I know of could offer, not even the great healers of the Ember Cliffs." "Then we find a cure before it reaches the heart," Cesario said simply. "That is the plan." He was the Alpha King. He said it as though it were fact because, in his world, his will had always been a kind of fact. He had spent 13 years forcing reality to comply with his decisions. The wasting vein did not comply. 3 weeks after that conversation in the tower, on the night of the frozen harvest moon, when the entire court of Vordheim had gathered in the great hall for the ceremonial feast, Cesario Vane walked through the great doors, took 3 steps toward his throne, and collapsed. The black veins had spread to his throat overnight. The trembling had graduated to a full-body seizure. He hit the stone floor with a sound that silenced 200 wolves mid-conversation. His eyes rolled back. His golden alpha aura, that overwhelming, radiant force that had made grown warriors instinctively step back since the day he had first shifted at age 15, guttered and went dark, like a torch suddenly snuffed by wind. and the silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that hall had ever heard. "Get the healers," Lord Brennan's voice broke first, cutting through the frozen crowd. They came. Every senior healer in Vordheim Castle, every physician who had pledged service to the crown, every herbalist and root worker and blood binder in the city below. They gathered in the throne room in a ring around the fallen king, torches and lanterns held high, faces pale in the yellow light. And then, one by one, they took a step back. "The corruption is too far advanced," said the head physician, a pompous man named Aldous, his voice carefully composed. "To place our hands on him at this stage of the wasting vein would be to invite it into ourselves. It is a known risk." "He is the king," Brennan snarled. "He is dying," Aldous replied, and the flatness in his voice was somehow worse than cruelty. "And no healer, no matter their training, can be expected to sacrifice their own life for a cause with no path to success. The corruption has reached his sternum. It will reach his heart by morning. There is nothing to be done." Brennan's fists clenched at his sides. He looked around the ring of healers, at the averted eyes, the carefully held torches, the faces of people who had sworn oaths and were now finding very technical reasons why those oaths did not apply to this particular moment. "Someone," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "someone in this room has the courage to try." Nobody moved. The great hall of Vordheim Castle, which had hosted 1,000 celebrations and 100 councils and at least 3 assassinations in its history, had never felt as small as it did in that moment. The frozen harvest moon poured silver light through the high windows and laid it across the king's still body on the stone floor. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythms. The black veins pulsed at his throat like something alive. Nobody moved. And then a sound came from the far end of the hall, not a dramatic entrance, not the sweep of a cape or the ring of boots on stone, just a soft, hesitant step, and then another, and another. The crowd parted instinctively, the way crowds part for the very powerful and for the very strange, and what moved through the gap was neither of those things. It was a girl. Perhaps 17, perhaps younger. It was difficult to tell because hunger and hard living had a way of making people seem ageless in the worst way. She was small and thin, with dark hair that had been cut unevenly, and eyes that were a shade of gray so pale they were almost colorless. She wore the rough gray tunic and patched trousers of a castle servant, the lowest of the low, the kind of worker who was never seen in the great hall except to carry trays or sweep ashes. She walked through the parted crowd with her eyes fixed on the king on the floor, and her hands, which should have been the hands of a girl carrying plates or hauling water, were glowing. Not brightly, not dramatically. A soft, steady silver light that pooled in her palms and pulsed gently with each heartbeat, the way moonlight pulses on still water when the wind moves it. "Stop her," Aldous said sharply. "That is, someone stop that girl. What is she doing in here?" But no one stopped her, not because they approved, not because they understood, but because there was something in the way she walked, straight-spined, unhurried, completely focused, that made it somehow impossible to step in front of her, as if the space between her and the king had already been decided by something larger than any of them. She reached him and dropped to her knees on the stone floor. She pressed both glowing palms flat to his chest. And the black veins, those pulsing, creeping, patient threads of corruption, stopped moving. Every witness in that hall would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe what happened next and failing. Some said the light expanded from her hands in a ring, like ripples in water. Some said they heard a sound like the lowest note on a great instrument, felt more than heard. Some said they simply felt the air change, the way the air changes just before a storm breaks, when the world holds its breath. Lord Brennan, who was standing closer than anyone, saw the girl's face. He saw her eyes, which had been pale gray, flood slowly with silver light from edge to edge, until there was no white left in them, just that cool, luminous silver that belonged to moonlight and old magic and things that had no name in the current world's vocabulary. He saw the black veins in the king's throat begin to recede. He saw her hands shaking with the effort of it, her whole small body trembling as if she were holding something massive above her head by will alone. And he heard her whisper, just loud enough for him alone to catch, because he was the only one close enough, 4 words into the silence of the great hall. "Don't you dare go. There are things that are taken from people slowly, so they do not notice until there is nothing left. A name is the first thing they take. It is never the last." Saoirse had been inside Vordheim Castle for 6 months, and in 6 months, not a single person had learned her name. She had arrived in the autumn with a supply wagon from the Duskwater lowlands, curled between sacks of grain with her knees pulled to her chest, and her glowing hands tucked beneath her thighs, so the silver light would not show through the canvas. The wagon driver, a gap-toothed man named Os, had known she was there, and had said nothing because she had offered him the last thing she possessed, a small carved bone token stamped with the crest of a pack she no longer belonged to. He had looked at it for a long moment, looked at her, and then clicked his tongue at his horses. She had not explained herself, he had not asked. In Vordheim, she had attached herself quietly to the castle laundry staff, the group of Omegas and low-bloods who worked in the deep basement levels, where the steam from the wash vats made the walls run with condensation, and the light never quite reached the corners. She was useful with her hands. She worked without complaining. She ate whatever scraps were left at the end of the day. She slept on a pallet in the corner of the linen room with 3 other girls who never asked where she had come from, because they had their own stories they were not ready to tell. In the laundry, they called her Ash, not because of her complexion, though her skin was pale enough to earn it, but because she was always in the ash corner by the old furnace when the morning shift started, sitting with her knees together and her palms turned upward in her lap, watching the glow fade from her hands as the sun rose. The other girls had stopped commenting on the glow after the first week. In the basement levels of Vordheim, where hard lives produced hard people, unusual things were met with the same response as ordinary things: silence and a quick return to work. What they did not know, what Saoirse had never told anyone in the 6 months she had lived in their midst, was that she had come to Vordheim with a purpose. She had come because someone in this castle was going to try to kill the king, and she was the only person in the known world who could stop it. She knew this the way she knew most things, not through reason or evidence or council intelligence. She knew it through the hands. The silver glow was not decoration, and it was not, as the pack healer of her childhood village had called it, a curse. It was a sense, a perception. The way a wolf's nose could read the air for danger, Saoirse's hands could read the living current that flowed through all things, through blood, through stone, through water, through the roots of trees, and feel where it was being disturbed, where dark hands had pressed against the natural order and left their prints. She had first felt the disturbance in the autumn, when the supply wagon had rolled through the lower gates of Vordheim, and the castle's energy had hit her skin like a wave. Something inside these walls was wrong. Something old and deliberate and very patient. She had felt it the way you feel a splinter under skin that hasn't yet broken the surface, a wrongness that has no visible wound yet. She had stayed and she had waited, and she had worked and listened and kept her hands hidden. She had learned the castle the way the forgotten always learn places, through the cracks in walls and the habits of those who never notice servants. She learned which corridors Lord Brennan walked at midnight when he could not sleep, and which ones the court herald used to avoid the Lord's patrol. She learned where the kitchen servants left food at the end of the night, and which of the junior guards was sleeping through his post at the East Tower. She learned that the head physician Aldous ate his dinner in his private office instead of the staff hall, and that he locked his door with 3 bolts, and that he sometimes received visitors after dark, who used the servants' entrance and wore hoods that were just slightly too deep to be practical in the windless inner corridors. She learned these things, and she filed them quietly away, and she said nothing to anyone. Because who would she tell? She was the cursed Omega girl with glowing hands who had arrived in a grain sack. She had no rank, no name that anyone recognized, no pack whose seal she could present. In the hierarchy of the Lycan world, she was less than nothing. She was the thing they invented the word Omega to describe when nothing felt too dignified. And yet her hands glowed. And yet she could feel the dark current threading through the stone of Vordheim Castle like a root system, patient, invisible, spreading. She had traced it for 6 months. She knew its pattern. She knew where it was coming from, and she knew what it was designed to do. She just had not moved yet, because she was not entirely sure she would survive moving. The night of the harvest moon changed the calculation. She had been in the servant corridor behind the great hall, one of the narrow passages built into the walls so that serving staff could carry plates in and out without interrupting court proceedings, when she felt it. A sudden, massive rupture in the current, like a wall collapsing, like something that had been held back for a long time finally breaking through its restraint. She had pressed her palm to the stone wall and felt the king's life force, that brilliant, almost blinding pillar of alpha energy that had been the most powerful thing she had ever touched through stone, spasm, stutter, and begin to fall. He is going now, she thought, and the thought was startlingly calm. If I do not go now, he will be gone before the hour turns. She had stood in the dark corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she had pushed open the hidden door and walked out into the great hall. She had felt every eye in the room turn to her. She had felt the weight of judgment, the contempt, the confusion, the instant dismissal of a girl too small and too low-born to be taken seriously, settle over her like a second skin. She was used to it. It had been her skin for as long as she could remember. She had kept walking. She had knelt beside the king, pressed her hands to his chest, and felt the corruption rush toward her contact the way darkness rushes toward light, not retreating, but attacking, trying to cross through her hands into her body. She had held it. It was the most painful thing she had ever done. It felt like pressing her bare hands against a fire and choosing not to pull back. The dark current was strong, and it was angry, and it had been growing for weeks, and it did not want to be interrupted. It pushed back against her with everything it had. "Don't you dare go," she had whispered, not to the corruption, but to the man beneath her hands, to the life force that was flickering like a candle in wind, to the brilliant, powerful presence that was retreating into itself, pulling back from the surface of things the way all lives do when they prepare to leave. Stay. And against all logic, against the cold certainty of every healer who had backed away, against the advanced stage of the poison, against the power of whatever dark arts had been used to plant it, the life force had paused. It had not come rushing back. It had simply stopped going. It had paused at the edge, trembling, uncertain, the way a person on a high ledge pauses when someone below calls their name. And that pause was enough. Because Saoirse had not just stopped the bleeding, she had started the conversation. She pulled the dark current backward through the king's channels, not all at once, not dramatically, but thread by thread, the way you pick apart a knot by finding the right loose end and working it slowly, patiently, without force. Her hands burned. Her vision went silver and then gray and then silver again. Her nose was bleeding before the first minute was done, and she could feel distantly that she was shaking, that her body was objecting very loudly to what she was asking it to do. She did not stop. She was still working when Lord Brennan's strong hands gripped her shoulders from behind, steadying her so she would not fall forward across the king's chest. She was still working when the harvest moon reached its highest point and poured its full silver light through the throne room windows, and the watching crowd made a sound, a collective exhale, as the black veins in the king's throat faded from dark to gray. She was still working, barely conscious, when Cesario Vane's golden eyes, Those famous fierce amber eyes that had made lords reconsider rebellions and made enemies turn and walk away from fights they thought they wanted, opened and found her face. She was the first thing he saw when he came back from the edge of death. Later, much later, when the healers had finally been shamed into approaching and were fussing over him with compounds and wrappings, when the court was in an uproar, and Lord Brennan was issuing commands in every direction, when the political machinery of a great castle had swung into the emergency protocols that existed for exactly this kind of moment, in all that noise and movement and restored ordinary chaos, Cesario reached out and caught Saoirse's wrist before she could be carried out of the room by the current of people moving around her. His grip was weak. It was the grip of a man who had just been pulled back from a ledge by someone smaller than him, but it was deliberate. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. His voice, when it came, was barely above a rasp, but it was clear. "What is your name?" She hesitated, not because she did not have one, but because it had been a very long time since anyone had asked. "Saoirse," she said. He repeated it slowly, testing the sound of it. Then, "Who are you?" And she said the truest thing she knew. "I am the only one who came." Dark magic does not announce itself. It arrives wearing the face of something you already trust. Cesario Vane did not stay in bed. This was, according to every healer who attempted to advise him in the 2 days following his collapse, the single most counterproductive decision a recovering man could make. Marin, who had served the royal household long enough to have some diplomatic credit with the king, used it all in one visit on the morning after the feast, standing at the foot of his bed with her arms folded, and her expression suggesting that she would not move until he agreed to remain horizontal for at least 48 hours. He agreed, looked her in the eye while doing so, and was at his desk within the hour. He was the Alpha King. Rest, in his vocabulary, was what happened between battles when no new battle had yet presented itself. The corruption was still in him. Saoirse had not removed it in one night. She had, as Lord Brennan described to him in careful detail, held it at the edge of crisis and begun working it backward. The process, she had apparently explained to Brennan in the brief period she had been lucid between treating the king and collapsing herself, would take time. It could not be rushed. The dark current had been in his channels for weeks, and it had laid roots. Those roots had to be found and dissolved one by one, or they would simply regrow. "And where is she now?" Cesario asked. Brennan, who had been standing in the doorway with the particular posture of a man braced for multiple arguments, blinked. "The girl." "Saoirse," Cesario said, with a precision that made Brennan blink again. She was taken to a recovery room in the East Wing. She lost consciousness during what she did. The physicians say she is not physically injured, but she is exhausted in a way they do not have a name for." Cesario set down the report he had been reading. "She is to have a proper room, not the East Wing servants' quarters, a guest room, with a fire and food." Brennan opened his mouth, appeared to reconsider several responses, and chose, "Yes, my king. And I want everything you can find on a dark art called the Wasting Vein. Every text in the Vordheim archive, every council record that mentions it, every incident in the last century. You want to know who planted it. I want to know who planted it, who paid for it, how long it has been in motion, and whether there are any other targets." He picked up the report again. "That is what I want." What followed were 3 days of a quiet, controlled frenzy that only the inner circle of Vordheim's court was aware of. On the surface, life in the castle continued its ceremonial rhythms: morning councils, afternoon audiences, evening meals in the great hall where the king's seat was filled by his presence and his composure, and the carefully managed information that he had suffered a temporary seizure from battle fatigue and was recovering well. Beneath that surface, Cesario and Brennan were pulling threads. The archive texts on the Wasting Vein were deeply unsettling. The corruption had first been documented in 1389, during the War of the Grey Thrones, a period of intense political violence between the eastern and western territories during which half of the Lycan nobility had ended up dead, and no one had been entirely certain who had done most of it. The wasting vane was listed in the war documents as a weapon, a dark art that required three components. The first was physical access to the target, something that had to be introduced into their body directly, typically through food or drink. The second was a sustained casting. A dark practitioner had to maintain the corruption from a distance, feeding it regularly or it would dissolve. The third was time. The wasting vane was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to weaken, to dim, to make a powerful person seem to be failing for reasons of natural health while the real cause remained invisible. "It is the perfect weapon for a court," Brennan said grimly on the evening of the second day, reading from the archive scroll with his jaw set. "It looks like illness. It acts like illness. And by the time any healer identifies it correctly, the target is too far gone to treat." "Except they were not counting on Saoirse," Cesario said. "No," Brennan agreed. "I do not think anyone was counting on her." They were in Cesario's private study, a room that smelled of old books and wood smoke, and the particular leather and iron scent that was simply the smell of the man himself. The fire was high. The candles were burning low. Outside, snow was building on the window ledges in slow, silent layers. "The casting has to be maintained from close proximity," Cesario said, returning to the report. "Whoever is doing this is inside Vordheim. It is not a distant enemy." "It never is," Brennan said quietly. They looked at each other across the study table. "Aldous," Cesario said, "I have been thinking the same thing for 2 days." He backed away the fastest. He used the most technically precise language about why the corruption was untreatable. He knew the wasting vane by name when no other healer in the room used that term. "And he has been receiving hooded visitors through the servants' entrance after dark," Brennan added. "I know because you were not the only one in this castle who noticed things they were not supposed to notice." Cesario leaned back in his chair. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple, not from pain, not exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who has been betrayed by someone he fed at his own table for 7 years. "Who is he working for?" "That," Brennan said, "is the part I cannot yet answer, but I have a direction. The hooded visitors, one of them was identified by the East Gate guard before he was bribed into silence. The guard is now under my protection and talking freely. The visitor wore a pendant, a white stone cut in the shape of a half-moon. It is the private seal of House Valgard." "House Valgard?" Cesario was very still for a long moment. House Valgard was one of the oldest noble houses in the Western Territories. Its current lord was Magnus Valgard, a smooth, silver-tongued man of 50 who had sat on the Royal Advisory Council for 15 years and who had, during every one of those years, expressed absolute loyalty to the crown, with the practiced ease of someone who had been practicing that particular performance for a very long time. Magnus Valgard, who had no army of his own, but who had close connections to the Duskwater Pack, the same pack whose border raids had been demanding the king's military attention for weeks, whose raids had, conveniently, been the topic of the War Council on the morning when Cesario's hand had first trembled. "He used the raids as a distraction," Cesario said slowly. "While I was focused on the eastern border, the poison was being maintained. He needed my attention elsewhere. And if you had ridden out personally to deal with the Duskwater raids, as you were considering, you would have been away from Vordheim, far from any healer who might identify the corruption, and significantly closer to death in an environment where your collapse could be attributed to battle." "A very clean plan," Cesario said. "Yes. What does he want?" Brennan hesitated. Then, "Your seat, and the hand of your cousin, Lady Rava, who is next in the royal bloodline after you. Magnus Valgard's son, Draven, is 26 years old and has been attending every court ceremony for the past year with an enthusiasm that has nothing to do with cultural appreciation. Cesario stood and walked to the window. The snow outside was thick now, building against the glass. He looked at his own reflection in the dark pane, a large man in a dark tunic, the bruises of recent illness still visible at his throat, the faint shadow of black veins barely receded. He thought about Saoirse in the east wing, sleeping, apparently, with an intensity that one of the maids had described with evident discomfort as the sleep of someone very far away. She had not woken in 2 days. The silver glow in her hands had not faded, even unconscious. It persisted, soft and steady, and completely inexplicable by anything in the Vordheim archive. She had known. She had come to this castle knowing something was wrong. She had stayed and waited and watched, and on the night he was dying, she had walked out of the hidden servant corridor and pressed her bare, glowing hands to his chest, and held back death with what appeared to be nothing but stubbornness and that quiet silver light. He had a great many questions that needed answers. "Set a quiet watch on Aldous," he told Brennan, still facing the window. "Do not move on him yet. Let him think the crisis has passed and I am too ill to investigate. I want to know who else he has been in contact with and whether Magnus Valgard is the end of the chain or just another link." "And the girl?" Cesario turned from the window. His expression was the one his generals recognized, that particular combination of absolute resolve and something that was almost something warmer than resolve. "When she wakes," he said, "bring her to me, not to the council room, not to the throne room, here." He indicated the study with one hand. "Privately." Brennan's eyebrow moved, just slightly. "My king," he said carefully. "She saved my life, Brennan. The least I can do is speak to her like a person. Every person alive has a wound they walk with. The difference between the broken and the strong is not the wound. It is what they built around it." Saoirse woke in a room she did not recognize, and her first thought was that she had made a mistake. The ceiling was stone, like the laundry basement, but the stone was smooth and whitewashed rather than gray and damp. The fire was real, a proper hearth with seasoned wood, not the furnace grate she was used to. The blanket under her hands was wool, thick and clean, and smelled of lavender. There was a table by the wall with a covered tray on it, and the smell that drifted from beneath the cover was enough to make her stomach pull sharply. She sat up slowly. Her hands were bare on the blanket, glowing their soft silver in the gray morning light from the window. She turned them over once, checking the light's steadiness. A habit so old it was automatic, the way people check a healing cut to see if it has closed. The glow was even. No spikes, no dimming. She was drained but functional. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and registered with distant surprise that she was not wearing her gray servant's tunic. Someone had dressed her in a proper sleeping shirt, clean, soft, bewilderingly white. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and just breathed. She thought about the throne room, about the weight of that corruption under her hands, the sheer, layered deliberateness of it, the way it had been constructed with patience and expertise. This was not village dark magic. This was not the spiteful work of a hedge practitioner with a grudge. This was old knowledge, carefully applied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And it was not finished. She had interrupted it, she had pulled it back from crisis point, but the roots were still in him and the source was still active. Whoever was maintaining the casting had felt her interference last night, she was certain of that. The moment she had pressed her hands to the king, the dark current had fought back. It had reacted to her the way a living thing reacts to a threat. Intelligently, purposefully. "They know I am here now," she thought. "That changes everything." She was still sitting on the edge of the bed when the knock came. It was not a servant's knock. She had lived among servants long enough to know the sound, the brief, apologetic tap of someone who expected to be ignored or to be scolded for interrupting. This knock was measured and firm. the knock of someone who was accustomed to doors opening when they knocked on them. "Come in," she said. The door opened and Lord Brennan Asheville filled the frame. He was a large man, not as large as the king, but substantial, with the broad-shouldered, gravel-faced solidity of a warrior who had been one for several decades and intended to continue. He looked at her sitting on the edge of the bed with her glowing hands folded in her lap, and his expression did something complicated. "You are awake," he said. "Yes." "Good, the king wants to see you." He paused. "Are you well enough to walk?" "Yes," she said again. She stood, smoothed the sleeping shirt, looked down at it, and then looked at the tray on the table. The hunger in her stomach was significant. "Could I eat first?" Brennan said immediately, moving to pull the cover from the tray himself. He did it without ceremony or apparent thought, which told her something about him. "He said to bring you when you were ready, not before." She ate. She was not self-conscious about it. She had long since learned that self-consciousness about hunger was a luxury available only to people who were not very hungry. The tray held bread, a small pot of soft cheese, dried fruit, and a bowl of something warm and savory that she consumed without pausing to identify its components. Brennan stood near the door with his arms folded and watched the window. When she was done, she folded the cloth that had covered the tray and set it neatly beside the bowl. Brennan noticed something shifted in his expression. "The servant's clothes you came in were beyond repair," he said. "There are things in the chest." He nodded toward a wooden chest against the wall. "Take what fits." She dressed in a simple dark tunic and trousers, plain, practical, not servant's gray but not court finery either. She kept her hands visible. She had learned young that hiding the glow made people more frightened of it than seeing it did. Seen, it was strange. Hidden, it became a secret, and secrets made wolves aggressive. The walk to the king's private study took them through 3 corridors and up a short stair. The castle was waking around them. She could hear the kitchen sounds from below, the stamp of the guard change in the outer courtyard, the distant bark of someone issuing instructions in the stable yard. Ordinary morning sounds. The castle's surface moving as usual over the complicated things happening beneath it. Brennan knocked on a heavy oak door. "In," said the voice on the other side. She had heard him speak twice. Once when he had told Brennan about the Eastern garrison in the War Council corridor she had been listening through the wall of, and once when he had asked her name from the floor of the throne room. Both times, the voice had been authoritative in a way that had nothing to do with volume. It simply occupied the full space available to it, the way water fills whatever shape it is poured into. Seated at a desk, with documents spread around him and a half-empty cup of something at his elbow, and the morning light crossing the left side of his face, Cesario Vane looked substantially less invincible than his reputation suggested. He still looked formidable. She was not going to pretend otherwise. He was a large man with the kind of face that had been through weather, strong features, a jaw that could have been used as an architectural element, eyes that were a warm dark amber but watched things with the attention of something accustomed to identifying threats at distance. The bruising at his throat had faded to yellow at the edges. He was sitting straight, which was clearly an act of will rather than comfort. He looked at her, she looked at him. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from his desk. "How do you feel?" he asked. The question surprised her, not because it was complicated, but because it was the first time in recent memory that someone had asked it and meant it. "Tired," she said honestly, "but functional." "Good," he leaned back. "I am going to ask you several things and I want honest answers, not the answers you think are safe, not the answers a servant gives a king, honest ones." "All right," she said. "What are you?" She had expected. "Where are you from?" She had expected. "What did you do to me?" The directness of the actual question made her sit with it for a moment before answering. "I do not know entirely," she said. "I have been called a cursed Omega since I was a child. In the village where I grew up, the pack healer said my hands were marked by a goddess who was angry. That is the story that was told. And what is the true story? I do not know that either, not fully. She looked at her hands. I can feel the current that flows through living things, through people, through animals, through the land itself. When that current is disturbed, when it is interrupted or corrupted or pulled in a direction it should not go, I can feel it the way you feel heat from a fire. And with my hands I can interact with it, push it, redirect it, clear it. Like a healer. Not like any healer I have ever met. Healers work from the outside. They use compounds and plants and structured rituals. What I do comes from inside, from the hands directly. She paused. It costs something each time. Last night cost a great deal. What did it cost? She met his eyes. I do not know how much I have of it to spend. I do not know where the edge is. Last night I came very close to finding out. Cesario was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow called from the castle battlements, once sharp and then silence. You knew, he said. You came to Vordheim in the autumn knowing something was going to happen. It was not a question. He had worked it out already, she could see that. Yes. How? I felt the disturbance from 50 leagues away. In a town in the Duskwater lowlands during the summer. Something dark and deliberate moving toward Vordheim like a river flowing toward a sea. I followed it here. Why? He said it simply, the way he said everything. You had no obligation. You had no connection to this court. What you did last night was extraordinarily dangerous. Why did you follow a feeling 50 leagues to a castle where no one knew you? Saoirse thought about this for a long moment. She thought about the village she had grown up in, where she had been avoided since age 8 when her hands had first started glowing in the dark. She thought about the pack healer who had declared her cursed. She thought about the 3 packs she had tried to attach herself to in the years since, each of which had eventually found reasons, technical, hierarchical, instinctive, to push her back out. She thought about what it was like to be the thing that people did not want, and to spend your entire life trying to make yourself useful enough that they would keep you anyway. Because I could feel that someone was going to die, she said quietly. And I could feel that I was the only one who could do anything about it. And I have spent my whole life walking away from things I could have helped because I was afraid of what people would do when they saw my hands. She paused. I decided this time I would not walk away. Cesario looked at her. A long look, the kind that takes inventory not just of what a person says, but of the shape of the silence around what they say. The corruption is still in me, he said. Yes, the roots of it. Whoever is maintaining the casting, they will be aware by now that I interfered. They will try to strengthen it, or change its form, or move against you directly before I can complete what I started. Then we have limited time. Yes. I need you to finish what you started. He said it directly, without performance. Not because I am ordering you, because you are the only one who can, and I believe you know it. She did know it. She had known it since autumn. There is a condition, she said. His expression did not change. State it. When this is over, when the corruption is gone and the source is found and dealt with, I want to know what I am. I want the archives. I want every text in Vordheim that mentions what my hands can do. I have been called cursed for 17 years, and I want to know if that is true or if it is just the name people give to things they do not understand. Cesario Vane held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, done. Healing a wound is not the same as finding the blade. You must do both, or the wound will simply open again. They began the following morning. Cesario sat in the large chair by the study fire with his sleeves rolled back and his hands resting on his knees, and Saoirse sat on a low stool beside him with both palms pressed lightly to his inner forearms, and the work was nothing like what the court had witnessed in the throne room. There was no dramatic light, no visible silver expansion, no sound that could be felt in bone. It was quiet and it was slow, and from the outside it looked like almost nothing at all. but underneath the surface, it was the most complex thing Saoirse had ever done. The roots of the corruption were deep, and they were intricate. Whoever had constructed this had not simply introduced a dark current and let it run wild. They had shaped it, threaded it into the natural channels of Cesario's energy, the way a vine threads into stone, finding the gaps and the joins and pressing into them, growing around the natural structure so that pulling it out directly would damage the channels themselves. She had to go slowly. She had to find each tendril and trace it back to its origin point, then work it loose millimeter by millimeter, replacing its absence with her own clean current as she went so the channel did not collapse. It was painstaking, silent work, and it stretched across 5 days. On the first day, they barely spoke. She worked. He read documents and issued quiet orders to Brennan through the closed door, and occasionally, she became aware of this without lifting her eyes, watched her. On the second day, he asked, "Does it hurt you?" "Not exactly," she said, without lifting her hands from his forearm. "It is more like carrying weight. I can manage it, but I feel it." "Tell me if it becomes too much." "You would be the second person to ask me that." "Who was the first?" A pause. "No one," she said. "That is my point." He was quiet after that, but the quality of his silence changed. On the third day she asked, "Lord Brennan, how long has he served you?" "Since I was 19. He was my father's general. He chose to stay when the throne changed hands, which was not guaranteed." "He is loyal." "The most loyal person I know." "And the least loyal." She felt him tense under her hands, not physically in the current. "You do not have to answer." "Magnus Valgard," he said, and his voice was level, but the current under her palms was not. "He sits on my advisory council, has done for 15 years, smiles with great consistency." "That is him, then," she said quietly. "Not the channel. Aldous is the channel. Valgard is the source." Cesario went very still. "How do you know the name Aldous?" "I have been in this castle for 6 months," she said simply. "I watched. Aldous receives visitors through the servants' entrance on dark nights. One of them wore House Valgard's seal." The silence stretched. 6 months, Cesario said slowly. "You watched Aldous for 6 months and never told anyone." "Who would I have told? I was an Omega girl with glowing hands who arrived in a grain sack. I had no standing, no name anyone recognized, and the information I had was based on what I felt in my palms and through the stone walls. No council would have heard me out." Another silence. Longer. She could feel something moving in the current beneath her hands, not the corruption, but something older and quieter. Something that might have been, in a different context, called guilt. "No," he said finally, "I suppose they would not." On the fourth day, something changed. She had been working through a particularly dense cluster of corruption roots near his wrist, a place where the dark current had wound itself into a complicated knot. And she had leaned forward slightly to get a better angle, and she had not realized until the lean was complete that she had reduced the distance between them to less than a hand span. She could see the detail of his jaw from this angle, the silver thread just beginning to appear at his temple, the way the fire moved in his amber eyes when he was watching something he was trying to understand. He was watching her. She looked up and met his gaze, and for a moment neither of them did anything, said anything, moved anything. The fire crackled. The silver light from her hands moved between them in the small space. "You have been doing this for 4 days, he said quietly. "Yes." "You look less exhausted than I would expect." "I have had good food and a warm room. That helps considerably." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than a smile, but related to one. "Good food and a warm room," he repeated, "in exchange for holding death back with your bare hands." "It is a more than fair trade," she said, and she meant it. He studied her for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. "I am sorry," he said. That you were in this castle for 6 months carrying knowledge that could have ended this faster, and no one created a condition in which you could speak. She absorbed that. It was the kind of thing that could be dismissed easily, an apology from a king, political in its instinct. But she could feel his current when he said it, and it did not feel political. It felt like a man with a specific kind of conscience acknowledging a specific kind of failure. "You did not know I was here," she said. "No, but the system that made it impossible for you to be heard, that is mine. I built the system." She did not know what to do with that. She returned to her work, but she carried the words with her for the rest of the day, the way you carry something unexpected that turns out to be heavier than it looks. On the 5th day she finished. It was late afternoon when the last root of the corruption came free, a deep, stubborn thread that had wound itself around the very base of his alpha channel, the place where the source of a wolf's power lived. She had worked toward it for days, afraid of what she would find when she got there, because corruption near the source was the most dangerous kind. It was also the most revealing. When she touched it, when she laid her full attention against it and began to work it free, she felt it communicate back to her. Dark magic always did this at the source point. It was like touching the opposite end of a rope. You could feel what was holding the other end. She felt it for a long, clear, terrible moment. Then she pulled the thread free, and the corruption in Cesario Vane dissolved, all of it. The roots and the channels and the residue, dissolving into his body's natural current and dispersing like smoke. Cesario inhaled sharply. A sound escaped him, not pain, but the involuntary sound of something large and heavy being lifted off a person's chest. His alpha aura, which had been dim and guttering since the night of the feast, came back. It came back like sunlight returning after a storm, gradual, and then suddenly overwhelming, filling the study with that fierce, golden, unmistakable pressure that made the air feel different. Saoirse sat back on her stool and took her hands from his forearms. They were both very still for a moment. "It is gone," she said. He looked at his hands. He turned them over once, the mirror of what she always did when she checked her own light. "Yes," he said quietly, "I can feel it." He paused. "It is like breathing after something has been sitting on your chest for weeks and you had begun to accept the weight as normal." "That is exactly what it is like," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Around them, the study fire had burned low in the hours of concentrated work, and the room was lit now mostly by the gray evening light from the window and the residual silver glow fading slowly from her palms. "At the root," she said carefully, "when I reached the deepest point of the corruption, I could feel who was holding it." His eyes sharpened. "Aldous." "Aldous is the instrument. There is someone else. Someone with old training in the dark arts, someone who learned this from a lineage, not a book. The feel of it was familiar, the way a voice can sound familiar even when you do not recognize it specifically." She paused. "And there is one more thing." "Tell me." "You were not the only target. There is a second casting. Younger, less developed, it has been in place for less than a month. I felt its reflection in the residue of yours." She looked at him steadily. "Someone else in this castle is being poisoned, and it has been done by the same hand." Cesario stood. "Brennan," he said, and crossed to the door. "A good hunter does not strike the first rabbit. He waits until he can see the whole pattern of the chase." The second thread led them to Lady Rava. She was Cesario's cousin, his only surviving blood relative, a woman of 24 whose primary political function had been, for the past several years, to exist as a potential dynastic solution to the ongoing question of royal succession. She was sharp-minded and quietly observant in the way of people who have learned that their opinions are more welcome unspoken. And she had been, as Brennan's investigation revealed, the target of Draven Valgard's extremely deliberate courtship for the past 8 months. Draven Valgard was Magnus's son, 26, ambitious, handsome in the way that seems designed specifically to distract from the ambition beneath it. He had been present at court for a full year. He had been charming and helpful, and had expressed, on multiple carefully chosen occasions, a deep personal devotion to the stability of the crown. He had also, as it now appeared, arranged for his father's dark practitioner to begin a slow wasting vein on Rivath 3 weeks ago. The logic was clear and sickening. Cesario dies of the wasting vein, appearing to have suffered a progressive illness. Rivath, weakened by her own corruption and psychologically destabilized by grief, becomes a more pliable candidate for a politically arranged marriage. Draven Valgard marries the heir. Magnus's line controls the throne without ever having to fight for it. Elegant, Cesario said, when Brennan laid out the full structure of it in the war room on the evening of the 5th day. I will give them that. My king, Brennan said, how do you want to proceed? The war room was a windowless chamber off the main corridor of the upper castle, its walls covered in territorial maps and its long table scarred with years of packing boots and set-down weapons. Saoirse was present because Cesario had brought her without explanation, and no one had challenged it, and she stood near the wall with her arms folded, and her hands visible, and her expression carefully neutral while Brennan completed the briefing. The second casting on Rivath, how far advanced? Cesario asked, looking at Saoirse. Early stage, the roots are shallow, it can be addressed much more quickly than yours. She paused. Hours, not days. Rivath will need to be told. She is clever enough to handle it, Brennan said. Probably clever enough that she has already noticed something is wrong with her. And Aldous, Magnus Draven. Still unaware that you know. Aldous has continued his evening visitor routine for the past 5 days. Magnus sent a standard council report this morning, routine, cheerful. No change in behavior from either of them. Good. Cesario moved to the map. Magnus believes the wasting vein will reassert itself now that the Harvest Moon crisis has passed. He will be expecting a report of my deterioration within the week. He does not know what was done in this room over the past 5 days. He will find out soon, Brennan said. These things cannot be hidden indefinitely in a court. Then we move before he does. Cesario placed 2 fingers on the map, one on the castle symbol representing Vordheim, one on the western territory marker that indicated Magnus Valgard's seat of power. We need complete evidence before the council, not suspicion, proof. Every link in the chain. Aldous Magnus, the dark practitioner maintaining the casting, every communication between them. That could take weeks we may not have. Saoirse, Cesario said, turning, is the practitioner who maintained the casting still active, still sending it? She thought of the feel of the root at the source point, the signature she had touched in the last moments of the work. Yes, they are still active. They will know by now that yours has been dismantled, which means they will be accelerating Rivath's. And, she paused, they will potentially try to establish a new casting on you. Can they? Not easily, not quickly. What I did left your channels clean and reinforced. It would be difficult to reintroduce the dark current without significant effort and time. She looked at him. But it is not impossible. Then we have a window. He stood straighter, and in the torchlight of the war room Saoirse saw the king that people described in war reports. The one who had faced down the Duskwater armies at the Battle of Red Crossing at 19 years old and come out the other side with a kingdom. The illness was gone from him, and in its place was something that could only be called clarity, a sharpened, absolute attention that made the room feel more focused simply because he was in it. Treat Rivath tonight, he told Saoirse. I will speak with her first so she is prepared. Yes. And I want Aldous followed from this moment. He will not be confronted, he will be allowed to act. If he sends word to Magnus that the casting has failed, Magnus will move. We want to see how he moves. My king, Brennan said, already moving toward the door. I already have 2 men on him. Of course you do. Saoirse watched Brennan leave, then looked back at Cesario, who was still studying the map. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Magnus Valgard has been on your council for 15 years. You fed him at your table. You heard his reports and took his advice. And he spent those 15 years planning this. Yes, Cesario said, without looking up from the map. Does that? She stopped. He looked up. Does it hurt? I was going to ask if it surprises you, but that is not quite right either. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. My father told me when I was a boy that the most dangerous people in any court are not the ones who hate you openly. They are the ones who have been patient enough to make you forget to watch them. He looked back at the map. I forgot to watch Magnus. That is on me. The surprise is not that he turned out to be what he is. The surprise is that I allowed myself to stop seeing it. She considered that. You trusted him. I believed I was a good enough judge of people to know the difference between loyalty and performance. Apparently, I needed a 17-year-old Omega girl with glowing hands to demonstrate that I am not infallible. There was something dry in his voice, not quite self-deprecation but adjacent to it. She found she liked it. You are recovering remarkably well, she said. From the wasting vein. From the humility. He looked at her, and this time the thing in his expression was unambiguously a smile. Brief, quiet, but real. Go treat my cousin, he said, and then get some sleep. You sound like you are giving orders. I am always giving orders. It is a professional habit. She left the war room. She did not look back, but she was aware, in the way that she was aware of all currents, that his eyes stayed on the door for a moment after she had gone through it. There is a difference between catching a wolf in a trap and catching him in the truth. A trap can be broken. The truth holds forever. Vane was sitting by her window when Saoirse was brought to her chamber, and she did not look surprised. She was a slight woman with Cesario's coloring in a softer register. Amber eyes, a shade warmer, dark hair cut closer to her face, the kind of self-containment that comes from years of being the politically significant relation of a powerful man. She wore it quietly. She sat with her hands in her lap, watching the snow outside with an expression of such deliberate calm that Saoirse, who could read beneath surfaces, recognized it immediately as the expression of someone who had been performing calm long enough to be exhausted by it. You are the girl from the throne room, Rivas said, without turning from the window. Yes. Cesario told me what you did and what you are going to do now. She finally looked at Saoirse. How bad is it? Early stage. You will feel better by morning. I thought it was grief. My handmaiden Pella died in the autumn. I thought. She stopped. No, I noticed 3 weeks ago that something was wrong with me. I did not know what. You noticed? I could feel it, like a wrongness under my skin that I could not place. She looked at her own hands. I am not a healer. I have no particular sensitivity, but something in me knew. That is not unusual, Saoirse said gently. A body knows when it is being interfered with. People do not always have the language for it, but they feel it. Ravan nodded once, then Draven Valgard. Not a question. The casting was commissioned by his father, Saoirse said carefully. And Draven. I cannot tell you what he knows and what he does not. That is for your cousin to determine. Ravat turned back to the window. Her hands tightened slightly in her lap, the only sign. I liked him, she said quietly. That is the part that is difficult to carry. I was not in love with him, but I liked him. He was good company and he asked good questions and he seemed genuinely interested. He may have been, Saoirse said. The two things are not necessarily exclusive. That is a surprisingly generous reading. I have spent my life being read at my worst possible interpretation. I try not to apply that to others unless it is proven. Raval looked at her again, a full, considering look. You are not what I expected, she said. Most people say that. I mean it as a significant compliment. Saoirse sat on the stool beside the chair, extended her hands and began. The work on Reva was faster and less technically demanding than the king's had been. The roots were shallow, the pattern simpler. But it was emotionally complicated in a way the king's had not been, because Reva, unlike Cesario, was not accustomed to receiving direct care. She went rigid at the first touch of Saoirse's hands and stayed rigid for a long time, and Saoirse could feel the knot of old self-sufficiency in her current. The way someone holds their breath when they have learned that needing help leads to vulnerability. "You can breathe," Saoirse said quietly. Reva exhaled, long and shaky, and then, to her apparent great irritation, began to cry silently, the tears of someone who has been holding something tightly for weeks and has finally, unexpectedly, been handed permission to set it down. Saoirse worked and said nothing and let her cry. It took 3 hours. When it was done, Reva sat forward and pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes with a sound that was half embarrassed laugh and half something more honest. "I feel like myself," she said, apparently surprised. "Yes. It is remarkable." "You were remarkable," Saoirse said. "Functioning this well with the corruption active, that is not typical. You have a strong current." Reva looked at her hands, then at Saoirse's still glowing ones. "Cesario is going to set a trap for them," she said. "Magnus and Aldous." "Yes. He is going to want me to be part of it, to draw Draven out." "That would be his calculation, yes." Reva nodded slowly, her jaw set with the same kind of resolution Saoirse had seen in Cesario, quieter in register, but equally absolute. "Good," she said. "I want to be part of it." The trap was elegant, in the way that Cesario's plans tended to be elegant, which was to say, it appeared simple on the surface and was architecturally complex beneath. Brennan, acting on the king's instruction, allowed a specific piece of false information to reach Aldous through a compromised junior guard. The information: the king's condition had worsened following the girl's interference at the Harvest Moon Feast. The corruption, far from being cleared, had been redirected in a way that was accelerating the wasting Vane's progress. The king was not expected to last the week. It was the information that Magnus Valgard and his practitioner needed in order to activate the next phase of their plan. They activated it within 48 hours. Draven Valgard arrived at court 2 days after Brennan's false information had been delivered, riding in with a small retinue, and presenting himself at the gates with an expression of grave concern, and a letter from his father expressing deep anxiety about the health of the king and hoping, most sincerely, that there was anything the Valgard household could do in this difficult time. The letter was a masterwork of plausible deniability. Every sentence could be read 2 ways. Cesario received him in the great hall. Saoirse watched from the gallery above, a narrow walkway above the carved wooden screen at the south end of the hall, used by servants during large assemblies. She had Brennan's second-in-command, a sharp young soldier named Cale, beside her. Below in the hall, the king sat on the iron throne. He looked ill. This was the most unsettling part of the plan, from Saoirse's perspective, watching Cesario perform weakness he no longer felt. He had been meticulous about it. The bruise coloring at his throat was cosmetic. Brennan's wife, who had a gift for such things, had applied it that morning. He sat slightly forward in the throne, one hand resting on the armrest with fingers loosely curled rather than his usual squared grip. His voice, when he received Draven Valgard, was maintained at a register slightly below his natural projection. He was an excellent actor. She had not expected that. Draven performed concern with matching precision. He bowed low, expressed horror at the king's apparent decline, offered his family's resources, his personal devotion, and his father's deepest respect. He asked, with the careful casualness of someone who had rehearsed the casual, after Lady Reva's well-being in such difficult circumstances. "Lady Reva is also unwell," Cesario said, and the flatness in his voice was real enough, just applied to a different emotion than it appeared. "She keeps to her rooms." "I am deeply sorry," Draven said. "Perhaps, with your permission, I might pay my respects. We have spoken often this past year. I hope I have been a source of some comfort to her." "Of course," Cesario said. That was the signal. What Draven did not know was that the corridor outside Rivaz's chamber had been prepared for the past 12 hours. What he did not know was that Rivaz was not unwell. She was entirely recovered and sitting in her chair with the door slightly ajar, and a composure that would have impressed anyone who knew what she was sitting with. What he did not know was that Aldous the physician had been quietly, comprehensively searched, and that the finding of specific compounds in his private stores had been documented and witnessed by 4 of Brennan's most trusted men. What he did not know was that the dark practitioner maintaining both castings had been identified, a scholar from the Valgard estate who had arrived in Vordheim 3 weeks ago as part of an academic delegation, and was currently being held in a room in the lower castle. Draven Valgard walked into the corridor outside Rivaz's chamber with a small vial in his inner pocket, a concentrated dark compound that, when introduced into a person's current at close range, would accelerate the wasting vein to a final stage. He did not get to use it. Lord Brennan and 4 royal guards were waiting in the corridor. Cesario himself appeared from the shadow at the end of the hall, still wearing the cosmetic bruising at his throat, but standing with a spine that did not belong to a man who was dying, and watching Draven with amber eyes that had nothing weak in them at all. "The vial, please," Cesario said quietly. The color left Draven Valgard's face. "My king." "The vial." Brennan took it. "You will tell me everything," Cesario said, "or you will stand before the Grand Council in chains and let them find it out for themselves. Your choice, Draven. Make it quickly." Draven Valgard, who had inherited his father's ambition but not, as it turned out, his father's composure under pressure, chose the first option within 30 seconds. He told them everything. Justice, done properly, is not about punishment. It is about restoring what was taken. Everything else is just anger in formal clothing. The hearings took 4 days. The Grand Council of the 5 territories convened in the Vordheim Great Chamber, not the throne room where the king had collapsed, but the older, more formal council hall that had witnessed every major political reckoning since the territories had first been unified 200 years ago. Its walls were dark stone hung with territorial banners, its long central table worn smooth by generations of palms and elbows and maps and documents, its ceiling so high that candlelight barely reached it, and the top half of the room lived in permanent shadow. Cesario presided. He sat at the head of the table, fully recovered, the cosmetic bruising gone, his alpha aura restored to its full weight. The assembled lords and ladies of the 5 territories watched him with expressions ranging from relief to wariness to the particular attentiveness of people updating their political calculations in real time. Aldous confessed first, precisely, clinically, without apparent remorse. He was a man who had spent his life organizing information, and he organized his confession the same way. He had been approached by Magnus Valgard 7 years ago with an arrangement that had seemed at the time to offer him things he valued: academic resources, rare texts, freedom from the administrative constraints of royal service. In exchange, he had agreed to be available when called upon. He had told himself, for 7 years, that he would never actually be called upon for something of this magnitude. When he had found that 7 years of small compromises had made the large one easier than he had expected. He was removed from royal service. He would face the council's judgment. Magnus Valgard, when brought before the council under Brennan's escort, was a different kind of study. He was a man of practiced composure, silver-haired, impeccably presented, wearing his expression of mild concern the way he had worn it for 15 years, as though the world's events were always slightly disappointing but never quite surprising. He denied everything for the first 2 days with a systematic thoroughness that suggested he had prepared this defense long in advance. On the third day, the dark practitioner, the Valgard estate scholar, whose name was Soren, provided testimony that made denial impossible. Soren was a pragmatic man who had no loyalty to Magnus that outlasted the reality of his current situation, and his knowledge of the casting's construction and execution was granular and specific and documented by Saoirse's account of what she had felt in the corruption's root structure. The council's verdict was delivered at the end of the fourth day. Magnus Valgard was stripped of his titles, his lands, and his seat. His house was dissolved. He would spend the remainder of his life under house confinement in the Northern Territories, far from any court. Draven was stripped of his rank and barred from every territory under the crown's jurisdiction. The scholar Soren was imprisoned. Aldous was banned from medical practice for life. It was not execution. Several of the council lords had argued for execution. Cesario had listened to those arguments carefully and then said, in the tone that closed discussions without raising its volume, "Execution makes martyrs. Erasure from consequence, stripping everything they valued, is a more accurate justice." The matter was recorded, sealed, and placed in the council archive. It was done. Or nearly. There was one conversation that did not happen in the council hall. It happened the evening after the final verdict, in the private study, by the fire that had become, over the past 2 weeks, the location of some of the most honest exchanges Saoirse had ever been present for. She was sitting in her usual chair. The stool had been replaced, some days ago without ceremony, with a proper chair on the same side of the desk. When Cesario came in and sat down opposite her, and did not pick up any of the documents that were waiting for him. He looked at her for a long moment. "You are going to ask me what I am going to do now," she said. "I was going to ask what you want to do now," he said, with a slight emphasis on the second word that changed it entirely. "There is a difference." She thought about it. "The archive," she said. "You promised me the archive." "You have it. Marin has been preparing the relevant texts since the day after your first session, the ones referencing your kind of ability. There are more than I expected. She has been cross-referencing." "My kind of ability," Saoirse repeated slowly. "The texts call it the Moonkeeper gift. It has appeared in the historical record 7 times in the past 4 centuries, always in someone without a formal pack lineage, always dismissed as a curse because it does not fit the understood hierarchy of power. The last documented case was 90 years ago, in a woman who healed 3 different plagues across the Western Territories before dying at 42 with no formal recognition of what she had done." Saoirse sat very still. "Not a curse," she said very quietly. "Not remotely." She absorbed that in the way that a person absorbs something they have needed to hear for 17 years, slowly, carefully, as if rushing would break it. "I need time with the archive," she said. "You have as much time as you want," Cesario said. "The archive is available to you. Marin has offered to work through the texts with you. You have a room, a real one, for as long as you choose to use it." She looked at him carefully. "What are you offering me?" "A place," he said it simply. "This castle, this court, a position that has not existed before and will need to be named, but which would essentially mean that the Moonkeeper gift is available to the crown and to the people of this territory as you choose to apply it." He paused. "Not as a servant, not as a tool, as—" "As what?" she asked. He met her eyes. "As someone whose judgment I trust, whose presence I have come to value, whose counsel," a pause, "whose counsel I would benefit from considerably." It was, she recognized, a man who was very practiced at direct speech and very unpracticed at the specific kind of directness that required vulnerability, doing his best. "You are describing a great deal more than a position," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am." The fire shifted. Outside, a wind was moving through the castle walls, that particular winter sound that suggested the season was still making itself known. "I have spent my whole life being moved on from," she said, not as a complaint, simply as a fact she was laying on the table. Pack to pack, town to town. I have never stayed anywhere long enough to grow roots. I know. I do not know how to want something permanent. It feels like a trap sometimes, wanting something you could lose. I know that too, he said quietly. I have not lost many people I loved, but the ones I have lost, my father, my brother, I understand what it is to protect yourself from the possibility by keeping things at a distance. She looked at him. A real look, not the careful, observational look of someone reading a current, but the kind of look that a person gives another person when they are deciding whether to trust the ground. I am not going anywhere, he said, and then, with a dry edge, I have been rather forcibly reminded recently that I am not as invincible as I had assumed, but I am also not going anywhere. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "Ask me properly." Something moved in his expression. He stood, and she stood, because the room seemed to require it, the way certain moments require people to be upright for them. He crossed the small distance between them. He was very close. She could feel his current, that extraordinary, full-powered, restored alpha aura, like standing close to something that generates its own warmth. And beneath it, accessible only to her, the quieter signature that was specifically him, steady and complex, and she had learned in 2 weeks of sessions, fundamentally kind. "Stay," he said. He borrowed her word, the one she had whispered to him on the floor of the throne room that first night, with her hands pressed to his chest and death pressing back. She looked up at him. "Don't you dare go," she said, returning the rest of it. And then, because she had spent 17 years learning to be honest when honesty was the most frightening option, "Yes, I will stay." He put his hand against her face, gentle, unhurried, the way a person touches something they are learning to believe they are allowed to have. And she turned her cheek into it and closed her eyes, and the silver light in her palms brightened briefly, involuntarily, filling the space between them with its quiet, steady glow. Love between wolves is not a soft thing. It is the thing that makes a wolf stand in front of a fire for someone else and choose not to step back. Winter deepened. The frozen harvest moon gave way to the dark moon, and then to the new crescent of early winter proper, and Vordheim Castle settled into its cold season rhythms. Long council sessions by firelight, territories checking in with their reports, the business of a kingdom proceeding with the particular intensity of a governing body that has just survived a major internal crisis and is reorganizing its trust accordingly. There was a great deal of reorganization. Marin was appointed head of the Royal Medical Council, a position that had not previously existed because royal medicine had been organized under the head physician's office, which was now defunct. She accepted it with the equanimity of someone who had been running the thing in practice for years and was simply now receiving the formal acknowledgement. She set about restructuring the healer system with the enthusiasm of a woman who had a great many ideas she had not previously been in a position to implement. Lord Brennan was formally confirmed as commander of the royal forces, a title he had held in all but name for 13 years. He accepted it by saying, "About time," under his breath during the ceremony, which was close enough to gratitude from Brennan that everyone who knew him treated it as a formal celebration. Lady Revat returned to full health within a week of Saoirse's treatment, and she returned to court with a composure that had a new, harder quality underneath it. The composure of someone who has been near the edge and come back with a clearer sense of where they want to stand. She took over significant portions of the diplomatic correspondence that had previously been shared among 3 junior council members, and she managed it with a precision that impressed even the most resistant of the old guard lords. And Saoirse sat in the Vordheim archive. She sat in it for long hours every day, with Marin across the table from her and a spreading landscape of old texts between them. The Moonkeeper records were extraordinary, not in their volume, which was modest, but in their detail. Each documented case was specific and well observed. The 7th century moonkeeper who had identified corruption in a well before any animal or person fell ill, saving an entire settlement. The 13th century woman who had walked the boundary of a territorial dispute and felt the dark magic woven into the land itself, planted by a rival lord, and dismantled it over 3 months. The one from 90 years ago, her name had been Etta, and she had worked alone and unnamed for most of her life, and the texts about her had been written by a council scribe who had apparently been paying attention when no one else was. She died without recognition, Saoirse said one afternoon, setting down a text. Yes, Marin said, without looking up from her own document. That will not happen again, said a third voice from the doorway. Cesario was there, leaning on the doorframe, having come from what appeared to be another council session, because he was in formal attire with his expression carrying the slight tension it always held after 3 hours of diplomatic navigation. He looked at her across the room with an ease that had been building gradually over the past weeks. The ease of 2 people who have been honest with each other enough times that the honesty has become its own kind of comfort. That is a considerable statement, Saoirse said. I mean it to be. He came into the room and looked over her shoulder at the text she had been reading, close enough that she was aware of him, that particular awareness that had been a constant presence for weeks now, the way you are always aware of a fire in the room you are standing in. Etta, I have read about her. You have been reading the moonkeeper texts. I have been reading everything in this archive related to you. He said it simply, without embarrassment. I told you I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. With me specifically. With the gift, with the history of it, with what should have been done and was not. He moved to sit across from her in the place Marin had vacated. The older woman had apparently found a reason to check something in a far corner of the archive, and looked at her directly. There is a position in the formal structure of the royal court that has not been filled since 1401. It was called the King's Keeper. Its function was to maintain the health of the crown's channels, the energy of the kingdom itself, which is separate from the king's personal health, though related. The position was abolished after the purge because the last person who held it was killed in the political violence. The record of what they actually did was lost. Saoirse had been still, until now. Until I started reading moonkeeper texts and realized what the King's Keeper actually was. He looked at her steadily. I want to restore the position. I want it to be official, documented, compensated, and fully resourced. I want its holder to have council access and royal protection, and I want it to be you. She looked at him for a long moment. You are giving me a title, she said. I am giving you the title that was always yours by gift. I am simply formalizing what is already true. She thought of 17 years, of pack after pack, of gray tunics and servant corridors and the laundry basement, of the grain sack she had arrived in. Cursed Omega girl, she said quietly. King's Keeper, he replied, if you will have it. She breathed in slowly through her nose. The archive smelled of old paper and dust and candle wax. Outside, snow was falling. Somewhere below the castle, the kitchen sounds of the afternoon were rising up through the stone. There will be resistance, she said. There will be considerable resistance. Several council lords will object to the precedent, the lack of noble blood, the nature of the gift, and my judgment in general. They will be noted, heard, and overruled. You make that sound straightforward. It is not, but it is what will happen. She looked at her hands on the table, those hands that had been called cursed and hidden and pressed against the backs of her thighs in grain sacks to keep the light from showing. She turned them palm up, and the soft silver glow caught the candlelight. Yes, she said, I will have it. The formal investiture happened at the next full council session, which was not without incident. 3 lords registered formal objections, which were heard in full, and then overruled with the explanation that the council charter historically provided for the restoration of abolished positions under royal decree. 2 lords quietly left the hall before the ceremony. The remaining 8 witnessed Saoirse, standing at the head of the great council table in clothes that were not servants' grey and not court finery, but something practical and well-made in between, receive the formal designation of King's Keeper, and place her right hand, palm up and glowing, over the royal seal impression in the council record. Lord Brennan, watching from the side of the room, had an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the architectural structure in which a smile would sit. Rivat, seated at the council table, had an expression that was simply a smile, direct and warm and entirely unself-conscious. Cesario watched from the head of the table. He had always been careful to maintain the formal separation between his public conduct and his private life. It was a discipline that kings required, the art of performing one kind of attention while attending to another. But for a specific, brief moment during the ceremony, the careful separation lapsed. He looked at Saoirse with the full, direct quality of his personal attention rather than his public attention, and what was in his face during that moment was something none of the council lords had ever seen there before. They noted it, several of them filed it for future consideration. Whatever they made of it, they were right. History, honestly told, is not a list of great deeds. It is the story of who was in the room when it mattered and what they chose to do. Most of the people in those rooms have been forgotten. That does not mean they did not hold everything together. Spring came to Vordheim the way it always did, gradually and then all at once, the snow retreating from the castle walls in slow recession before suddenly one morning, the courtyard smelled of wet earth and the birds in the eaves were building nests, and the kitchen gardens were showing their first green threads above the soil. 6 months had passed since the night of the frozen harvest moon. 6 months was enough time for the court to settle into its new arrangements. It was enough time for the council lords who had objected to the King's Keeper position to discover, through practical experience, that having a moonkeeper in the castle was a significant advantage. 3 separate incidents in the late winter months, a dark compounding found in the river supply, a suspicious plant growth in the western granaries that turned out to have been deliberately seeded, and a minor territorial charm placed on the Ashfin Plains border that was causing unusual aggression in the wolves patrolling it, had been identified and resolved by Saoirse before they escalated. The council lords filed these facts alongside their previous reservations and updated their positions accordingly. 6 months was enough time for Marin's restructured medical council to begin producing the first generation of formally trained healers, who used both traditional compound methods and something closer to Saoirse's current treating, a new hybrid practice that had no name yet, but which was already being practiced in the castle's healing ward with results that were quietly extraordinary. 6 months was enough time for Rivat to begin a correspondence with the Lord of the Northern Territories, a correspondence that had begun as diplomatic and was becoming something less formally structured with some speed, which she discussed with Saoirse in the archive on afternoons when neither of them had formal obligations, with a mixture of amusement at herself and a cautious warmth that Saoirse recognized, because she had been carrying a version of it herself since winter. 6 months was enough time for 2 people who had found each other in a crisis to discover that what existed between them when the crisis receded was not gratitude, not obligation, not the manufactured closeness of shared danger, but something that had simply grown in the space they kept making for each other, the way things grow in good conditions when left to do so. They walked the castle battlements on spring evenings, a habit that had started in February when Cesario had found Saoirse there one evening watching the snow fields catch the last light, and had come to stand beside her, and they had talked for an hour about nothing particularly significant, and the following evening he had come back and she had been there, and neither of them had made a formal arrangement of it. It had simply become a thing they did. On an evening in early spring, when the light was doing something remarkable over the western territories. That particular long, golden spring light that made even the bare hills look like something worth fighting for. They stood at the north parapet, and Saoirse was quiet for a long time, and Cesario, who had learned to recognize the quality of her different silences, waited. "I found something in the archive last week," she said finally. "Tell me." "A text from 1312, a record of a moonkeeper who served for 30 years in the court of an Eastern king. Her name was Bryn. She was not from a noble house. She had no pack. She arrived the same way I did, not in a grain sack, but close enough, and she served and she healed, and she is documented in 6 different council records over 3 decades, and then there is a final entry." "What does it say?" "It says, in the 31st year of her service, the king's keeper Bryn was given the formal title of Queen's Counselor upon the occasion of her marriage to King Aldwin of the Eastern March, who declared in the council record that he could identify no argument in law or precedent that should prevent a king from marrying the most intelligent and capable person in his court, regardless of blood." She paused. "And then the record ends." Cesario was quiet for a moment. "Aldwin of the Eastern March," he said. "He was considered something of an eccentric in his time. He is considered one of the most effective rulers the Eastern territories produced in the 14th century. "Yes, curious that." The light was fading now, the gold going to rose and then to the deep blue of a spring evening. Below them, the castle lights were beginning, the torches in the courtyard, the warm windows of the great hall, the distant glow from the kitchen that meant the evening meal was being prepared. Ordinary light, familiar and steady. "I am not telling you this to suggest anything," Saoirse said, which was the least convincing statement she had made in 6 months, because she was watching him from the side of her eyes with an expression that suggested the opposite. "Of course," Cesario said, equally without conviction. "I was simply noting a historical precedent." "Very scholarly of you." She looked at him then, directly, with the full attention she usually reserved for reading currents, and there was something in her expression that was both old and new. Old because it had always been there, that particular quality of her attention, focused, clear-eyed, not easily deflected. New because it was being applied without the careful distance she had maintained for the first months, without the self-protective armor of someone who expected to be moved on from. She was not expecting to be moved on from any more. "Cesario," she said. He turned to face her. "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "When you looked at me across the council table during the investiture, when you forgot to perform the formal separation for a moment, what was in your face?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of a man who is choosing his words because the words matter. "Everything," he said simply. She absorbed that. "I have been called cursed for 17 years, she said slowly. "And I have spent 17 years believing it was possible to outwork the label, to be useful enough, capable enough, precise enough in what I do, that the curse wouldn't matter, that people would keep me despite it." "Saoirse." "I am not finished." She held his gaze. "I do not need to outwork it anymore. I know what I am. I have the archive. I have the title. I have Marin and Rivet and Kale and Brennan who looks at me like I am his greatest logistical inconvenience and his clearest tactical asset simultaneously, which I have learned is his version of deep affection." A slight smile. "I do not need to outwork the label anymore. So what I am saying to you right now is not please keep me. What I am saying is, I want to be here, fully, not as the king's keeper and not even as the woman who saved you, though I am both of those things, as the woman I love," Cesario said. "Since you appear to be building toward it, and I have spent 6 months learning patience from you, and find this particular moment is testing it considerably." She stared at him. "I love you," he said again, with the directness he applied to everything, simple, settled, stated as fact, because, in his experience, the things he felt most deeply were the ones that required the least decoration. I have loved you since the evening you told me that you stayed because you decided this time you would not walk away. I have been trying to build a circumstance where you would want to stay permanently, and it appears you have been building the same thing from your end, which is—" And here, unexpectedly, something moved in his expression that was warmer than anything she had seen on his face in 6 months, the most characteristically you thing that has ever happened in my life. The spring evening was around them, the last light going, the first stars beginning in the east. Below them, the castle was alive with its ordinary sounds. Somewhere in the courtyard, a wolf was calling to someone across the yard, and someone called back, and the ordinary beautiful noise of a living place in a good season filled the space around them. Saoirse stepped forward and put her hands, still glowing, always glowing, her whole life's quiet signature against his chest. Not to heal, not to read, just to feel his current under her palms, that steady, complex, full-powered presence that she had first touched on the throne room floor when he was going and she was telling him to stay. It was the same, still exactly the same, just not going anywhere. "I love you too," she said, in case that was in question. "It was not," he said, "but I am glad to have it confirmed." He put both arms around her, and she turned her face into his chest, and the silver light from her palms spread briefly, involuntarily between them. That warm, steady, inexplicable light that was not a curse and never had been, and then settled. Held. The council annals of Vordheim for the year 1498 record the following, in the dry, precise language of official documentation. The position of King's Keeper, vacant since 1401, was formally restored in the 3rd month and filled by Saoirse of Vordheim, recognized bearer of the Moonkeeper gift, whose actions in the winter of 1497 prevented the assassination of King Cesario Vane by the wasting Vane corruption introduced at the commission of the dissolved House Valgard. In the same year, by royal decree and council witness, the King's Keeper was additionally granted the title of Queen Consort, upon the King's declaration that he was aware of no law, precedent, or argument of sufficient merit to prevent it. The investiture was witnessed by the full council. It was noted that Lord Brennan Ashville, commander of the royal forces, was observed to smile during the ceremony, which several scribes recorded as unprecedented. What the annals do not record, because annals never do, is the part that mattered most. The 17 years a girl spent being called a curse. The 6 months she spent in a castle basement watching through walls for the thing she could feel but could not yet prove. The night she walked out of a servant corridor with her glowing hands in front of her and chose, for the first time in her life, to not walk away. They do not record what it felt like to press her palms to a dying man's chest and hold the space between him and the dark with nothing but her own light and a refusal to let go. They do not record the moment, on a spring evening on the castle battlements, when she stopped waiting to be moved on from. History remembers the kings. History remembers the great battles and the council votes and the formal titles. But history was written by people who were not watching the right rooms. In the right rooms, in the right moments. It is always the one who stayed who holds everything together. It was always Saoirse. It always will be.